the convoy routes. Air patrols over the Bay of Biscay were also stepped up to catch more U-boats entering and leaving their French bases. In June 1941, in a move that startled the Germans, the United States declared that Allied convoys containing non-American merchant ships would now be escorted by American warships. Germany protested at this breach of international law, but to no effect. American destroyers would respond with force to any U-boat threat. In the new Western Hemisphere defense zone, the United States Navy now escorted convoys as far as 22 degrees west, halfway across the Atlantic. Air cover was growing stronger every month, but was still incomplete. The mid-Atlantic air gap still left convoys highly vulnerable to submarine attack. In September, the Germans changed their naval codes, and Dönitz immediately transferred 5 wolf packs back up north into the air gap. By the end of the month, 71% of all merchant ships destroyed had been sunk by wolf packs. This was the highest percentage of the battle yet, and proved that when supplied with good intelligence, the wolf packs were still unstoppable. With the devastating September attacks, Admiral Dönitz had seized the initiative from the Allies. Again and again, the Wolfpack had comprehensively defeated the convoy. However, in October, Hitler once more intervened in the U-boat war. Over the next 8 weeks, the Führer ordered 16 submarines to the aid of Axis forces in North Africa, aiming to cut the British Army's supply lines in the Mediterranean. The diversion of so many U-boats away from the Atlantic once again gave the Allied convoys an unexpected respite. In November, just 17 merchant ships were sunk in the North Atlantic. Only 4 were sunk in December. For 2 full months, the convoys had crossed the Atlantic almost unmolested, greatly increasing British supply levels. On December the 7th, 1941, the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese Navy. The United States declared war on Japan, and 4 days later, Germany, in support of her Axis partner, declared war on America. For the German U-boats, here was a rich new source of unprotected shipping. Cargo vessels bound for Britain were no longer the only submarine targets. Now, ships in American waters could be attacked. Admiral Dönitz knew that every Allied vessel sunk, whether British or American, would have to be replaced, costing the enemy precious time, raw materials, and manpower. The main priority of the United States Navy was in the Pacific Ocean, and it had as yet made few plans for participating in the Battle of the Atlantic. Domestic merchant ships continued to sail independently, believing it would be some time, if ever, before the war actually reached American waters. For the protection of the merchant fleet, the US Navy possessed just 3 destroyer flotillas and 5 Catalina squadrons to patrol a 1,500-mile coastline. Meanwhile, matters were not helped by a sudden wave of public hysteria, overwhelming the authorities with thousands of reported submarine and enemy invasion sightings. There were no city blackouts as chambers of commerce refused to jeopardize their valuable tourist trade. The bright lights of East Coast cities like Miami, Atlantic City, and New York made navigation simple for the U-boats prowling offshore. But worst of all, the bright lights perfectly silhouetted merchant ships for the U-boat commanders. Operation Paukenschlag, or drum roll, the German opening offensive against the United States, could for the time being only be carried out by 9 Type 9s, the only German submarines which had the range to operate on the eastern seaboard of the United States. The submarines were ordered not to shoot at any targets, unless especially large, until they had reached their stations along the east coast of New York, Boston, Portland, Maine, and Norfolk, Virginia. On January the 12th, 1942, when all 9 U-boats were in position, Dönitz ordered that the offensive begin. The first victim was a British tanker just off Cape Cod. Within 4 weeks of the start of the offensive, the U-boats operating independently destroyed 50 merchant ships, nearly 300,000 tons. This spectacular success convinced Hitler to allow more U-boats to be transferred from the Arctic and Mediterranean. In addition, 20 Type 7s, modified for longer ranges, were now able to reach Canada. Eastern Atlantic U-boat operations slowly spread as far as the Caribbean. In February, the U-boats sank another 55 merchants, much of whose cargo was ultimately bound for Britain. Over 1 million tons of American shipping was destroyed before a single U-boat was sunk. With sinkings now running at 627,000 tons a month, the United States was forced to resort to desperate measures. Firstly, in a reversal of Lend-Lease, Great Britain sent the US Navy 10 corvettes and 24 armed trawlers, complete with their trained and experienced crews. Then, along the east coast, a series of interlocking convoy operations was begun, and as resources allowed, these were continually expanded. For the first time, city blackouts were ordered by the federal government. Finally, the authorities took back 70 aircraft intended for the British Air Force and instead employed them on patrols along the coast. Week after week, all these improvements slowly took effect, and the number of sinkings began to fall. The Germans' second happy time was over. Dönitz knew that the U-boats' concentration in American waters had given a respite to British Atlantic convoys. U-boats operating along the US seaboard used up much of their supplies in just getting there, and could only remain on actual operations for a third of the time they could operate in the western approaches. The U-boats still had to destroy 700,000 tons of shipping a month in order to defeat Britain, and Dönitz decided it was time to return to the eastern Atlantic and reform the wolf packs. Great Britain's transfer of armed trawlers and corvettes to the United States had reduced the number of escorts available for British convoys, especially in the eastern Atlantic. The weakness was only offset by improvements in existing escort ships and patrol aircraft. Powerful spotlights were fitted to long-range aircraft and greatly helped their ability to hunt U-boats. While at sea, the first forward-throwing, multi-barrel depth charge called a hedgehog was proving highly successful. The hedgehog removed the escort's main weakness in close-range combat and finally allowed the warship to fire depth charges while still maintaining ASDIC contact. By the summer of 1942, the number of Allied escort groups had increased substantially, and every month, yet more would plough the convoy routes. Because their ships and crews worked together voyage after voyage, they became highly effective teams, and the escort groups soon developed into supreme U-boat killers.